All right, so inflation is seeming like it's going to be one of these issues that we just have to keep talking about, unfortunately, primarily because we have been seeing an absolutely massive onslaught of corporate propaganda, unsurprisingly being peddled by corporate media, and they're basically blaming inflation on everything other than the actual causes of inflation. We don't see too many people talking about the supply chain or blaming the structure of our capitalist system itself or the exporting of jobs overseas over the last number of decades, and instead, primarily, a lot of these corporate propagandists have been blaming, workers for not going back to work. They have been blaming higher wages. They have been blaming even the $1,400 stimulus check that went out 8 months ago at this point. And even Biden fell for that trap. So we're going to get into a lot of the propaganda that we have been seeing, but I have another theory here in terms of what is actually happening and what is causing inflation, right? Obviously, it's a complex issue. Every industry is going to be affected in different ways, right? I covered a video, I think it was last week, where we talked about how gas prices are actually higher because OPEC, this Saudi-led oil cartel, is restricting the supply of oil to the global market, and therefore our gas prices here are going to be elevated because of that. But here's another reason why inflation is happening within the economy, or at least being exacerbated within the economy, and it is unsurprisingly because of the structure of capitalism and the incentives that exist within this system. So here from Business Insider, corporations are using inflation as an excuse to raise prices and make fatter profits, and it's making the problem worse. Okay, so obviously under a capitalist system, all of these corporations have a profit incentive. That is the main driver of this entire system that we have, and they are using the inflation crisis that we have right now to further ramp up prices and basically hide it under the guise of general inflation issues, even though they don't really have to. Okay, so here's some of the details. They say consumer prices are going up, but corporate profits are rising even faster. Walmart, which announced third quarter financial results this morning, was able to post better than expected earnings in part by offering fewer discounts to shoppers, but a lot of large firms have spent their recent quarterly calls bragging to investors about their ability to hike prices with relative impunity. Okay, pretty brave here, but they say, quote, what we are very good at is pricing, Colgate-Palmolive CEO Noah Wallace said. Whether it's foreign exchange inflation or raw and packing material inflation, we have found ways over time to recover that in our margin line. So in other words, they're just passing the cost on to you and then some, okay? On top of the actual inflation that is real and that is existing, they are just adding on top of that because they can, I guess. Okay, so they continue here saying that we've been very comfortable with our ability to pass on the increases that we've seen at this point, Kroger CFO Gary Millerchip said in October, and we would expect that to continue to be the case. So again, they're bragging to investors to further inflate their already ridiculously inflated stock prices. And, this is the result. Okay, this is exactly what capitalists do. This is what the capitalist system will do in a moment of crisis. It will screw over average Americans. It will raise prices whenever they can just to make a fatter profit. Okay, so that is the reality of the situation right now. They continue here explaining, how dramatic this actually is, right? A lot of these massive corporations are doing this. So roughly 2/3 of the largest publicly traded U.S. companies, let me say that again, 2/3 of the largest publicly traded U.S. companies have reported better profits this year than the same period in 2019 before the pandemic. Okay, 2/3, a majority of the biggest companies within the United States are seeing better profits right now. If you're seeing better profits, then obviously a lot of this inflation is being severely exacerbated by them just simply choosing to raise prices because they can, again, just to pad their bottom line basically for their investors. Okay, this is what's actually happening. This is what is making inflation worse for average Americans, and yet we still have, and here is a good take from former Labor Secretary Robert Reich that I'll get to, but we still have all of these motherfuckers in corporate media, even Joe Biden himself, blaming some of the measly crumbs that went out to average Americans for inflation. Okay, Biden concedes his COVID stimulus checks fueled a spike in inflation. Okay, Biden, whose approval rating has been absolutely tanking recently, is choosing to attack the most popular thing that he has done so far in his presidency. Okay, understand how insanely ridiculous this is, not just from an economic perspective because he's simply wrong about this, but on top of that from a political perspective. It's like this guy wants his approval rating to tank even further. It's a complete joke. And then we also have corporate propagandists like Stephanie Rule from MSNBC, who are basically saying, This is due to higher wages within the economy, and people just have too much money in their pockets, right? We can all afford to pay the higher prices at the grocery store. We can afford to pay the higher prices at the gas pump because everybody's just extremely rich. We've all just gotten filthy rich off of the pandemic, right? I mean, it's just completely delusional corporate propaganda. They are blaming everything other than the actual causes, okay? You would never hear Stephanie Ruhle come out and do a commentary about how these massive corporations within the United States are simply choosing to fuck over average Americans on some of these prices. But again, back to Labor Secretary Robert Reich, I think he had a good take on all of this, explaining what is actually one of the main problems within our economy that allows companies to do this in the first place. And so he says he called this phenomenon a symptom of the economic concentration of the American economy in the hands of a relative few corporate giants with the power to raise prices. Inflation may be a problem for consumers, but the bigger issue is a lack of competition, and corporations are using the excuse of inflation to raise prices and make fatter profits. And so basically what he's trying to say there is that the monopolization that exists within the United States and our economy here, the monopolization of whether it's the food industry, okay, where a tiny handful of companies control basically all of the production of food within the United States and the distribution of food within the United States. We have the illusion of choice. When you go to the grocery store, right, you see all of these different fancy little differently packaged products, right, but they're all produced by the same fucking companies, okay? That is part of the problem. The problem is that we have all of this concentration within the economy in the hands of a few, and so when you get to an opportunity like this for them, and this is how they see the pandemic, as an opportunity to make further profits, they're going to take that opportunity, and there's no competition that can undercut their prices to force them to drive them back down. Okay, so this is primarily, in a large part, a consequence of really two things. One, the monopolization that exists within the United States, and so the solution to that would be massive trust busting, basically. But in addition to that, it's a consequence of just the structure of the capitalist system. Okay, this is what they're going to do when they have the opportunity to fatten their profit margins. They're going to do it. Okay, this is what it looks like. And so when you're in a disaster situation like a pandemic with a subsequent economic crisis, then it makes it even worse for average Americans, because now we're feeling inflation, and then on top of feeling the inflation largely due to the structure of this system, because we're feeling inflation, on top of that, they are now using inflation to argue against giving the American people more stimulus that would have helped them deal with the actual inflation that they are feeling. Okay, so it's just they're doubling down on how shitty the results of this are going to be for average working class Americans, while the rich are basically running out the door with all of the profits at the end of the day. So it's completely a perverse system. And understand, they never blame inflation on anything that benefits the rich and the powerful. Okay, so if you remember, I mean, I feel like a lot of people stopped talking about this, but there was a period at the beginning of the pandemic where they were so scared of the stock market collapsing that the Federal Reserve was pumping $1 trillion per day to prop up the stock market, okay? $1 trillion per day. Nobody says a fucking word about inflation, okay? The CARES Act as well, okay? This was one of the first major bills that they passed to tackle the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it, but the CARES Act was primarily a handout to corporate America. They gave them infinite sums of money, millions and billions of dollars in handouts to the largest corporations in the country that were supposed to take that money and use it to like protect their workers and invest in PPE and protecting their payrolls. And because there was basically no accountability within the CARES Act, a lot of these corporations took some of that pandemic money and just used it to do like stock buybacks to further inflate their profit margins and their stock value while firing large sections of their workforce. Okay, so all of these bills that have been passed have been massively corrupt handouts to the richest people and corporations in the country, while average Americans continue to get screwed. So that is the pattern clearly that exists within the system that we have right now. In addition to that, nobody brings up inflation. They just pass a $778 billion national defense bill. Okay, $778 billion. And Biden's agenda of the Build Back Better agenda has been whittled down to like what, $170 billion a year or something like that. That's a tiny fraction, which is supposed to represent the most bold investment in modern American history and into our social welfare plans. And all of the most popular portions got taken out of that bill. Meanwhile, they're handing nearly $1 trillion in 1 year to the Pentagon, who can't even pass an audit. So you want to talk about fiscal responsibility? You want to talk about inflation? I don't know, maybe go after the places where you're shoving the most amount of money in the least accountable ways. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but I'm sure that they have some fancy ways to undercut that argument. But I mean, listen, these are the places where you would actually focus if you gave a shit about fiscal responsibility, like Joe Manchin and other corporate ghouls always say that they care about. But they never talk about shit like this. They never do, because it's not based on principles. It's based on an ideological hatred, apparently, for working people and for a defense for corporate America, basically. So In addition to that, you want to talk about reducing inflation, pulling the money supply back, right? Pulling money out of the economy. Then how about you go after billionaires? How about you go after, guys like Elon Musk who are bragging and trying to dunk on Bernie Sanders on Twitter and crying and pissing his pants on Twitter because Bernie Sanders called for the bare minimum of billionaires to pay their fair share in taxes. I mean, they had this billionaire proposal, this billionaire tax proposal that literally would have only impacted like 700 people in the country. Okay, they couldn't even get that done. All right, so you want to talk about inflation, then maybe go where the most amount of money is, but they don't. Instead, they're again choosing to attack the measly crumbs that they gave average Americans. So it's a complete reversal of what the reality is actually screaming at Democrats to do. And in addition to that, just to top it all off, okay, the second biggest program in the Build Back Better Act is a tax cut for billionaires and millionaires, okay? The SALT cap reductions, which corporate Democrats threw in the Build Back Better, they said no SALT, no deal. So they threw it in at the last minute, and that seems to get passed, okay? So a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires is able to be added in this, which absolutely is not deficit neutral, okay? It's a massive negative, all right? That's why they're saying it's the second most costly part of the bill as it stands right now. This is much more costly than, free college and paid family leave and some of the other things that they took out of the bill that they told us, sorry, we simply can't afford to do those things, but apparently they can afford to give more handouts to the wealthiest and richest Americans in the country. It's just a complete joke. So listen, what is the actual takeaway from all of this, all right? The takeaway is that the capitalist system does not work for average working Americans. It just simply does not, all right? There is a direct conflict of interest or a direct opposition with the capitalist class and the working class, okay? Your priorities are in opposition to each other. So when you have a disaster like this, the wealthiest people, the people with the most power within the economy are going to use it as an opportunity to further entrench their power and further screw over average Americans, okay? That is the reality of our economic system. We've seen this in all of the bailouts that they have been sending out, which have primarily been handouts to corporate America. We are seeing this in now all of the establishment, both Republicans and Democrats, attacking the measly crumbs that they gave the American people and blaming things like wage increases, which have been, barely keeping up with inflation, if at all. And they're blaming everything but the actual problems that are causing inflation. Supply chain issues, the decades-long process of exporting jobs to China and out of the United States, okay? If you want to not have an unstable supply chain, then maybe produce things in the United States, right? But nobody's talking about these things. Nobody's talking about the long-term solutions to fixing our unstable, clearly volatile supply chains. Nobody's talking about pulling money. If you're talking about inflation, pull money from the places that have the most money, like billionaires and millionaires and gigantic corporations. Instead, they're choosing to run full speed in the opposite direction. This is a political disaster, and on top of that, it's an economic disaster.